Was in the World War II in the Pacific Theater, and I was in the U.S. Navy, attached to the 4th Marine Division, 121st Naval Construction Battalion,
And-
Seabees.
Excellent. And what was your highest rank attained?
3rd class petty officer.
Very good. Now, were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted.
Where were you living at the time when you went into the Navy?
In New Britain, Connecticut.
What was that like? What was it like at the time?
What was it like then?
Yeah.
I had graduated from high school. This was in 1944, June 1944, graduated from New Britain High School. And I joined the Navy. I went to New Haven, Connecticut. And there I joined the Navy and was sent to Sampson Naval Training Station in Upper New York State on Lake Seneca, the 5 Finger Lakes there outside of Geneva, New York. And that's where the Naval Training Station for the New England states, including New York State, was.
What did it feel like there at the Naval Training Station?
Well, this was a period of 10 to 12 weeks of training. And they established a routine. You'd be up in the morning by 5 o'clock. And after dressing, you would go out and run around the drill field and do exercises. And that started the day. After exercise, you'd come back and shower or clean up and then go to breakfast. After breakfast, there would be a particular duty given that day, depending upon what type of training you would go under. We had field training where we went on boats on Lake Seneca, and this was considered the lifeboat training was for abandoned ship drill, where the lifeboats were turned over and we had to right them and to get back inside the lifeboats. There was other marching. We did a lot of marching and drilling, and this was a huge Navy base. There must have been 4,000 to 5,000 sailors in different stages of training, but this was called basic training. And after basic training, you were informed that you would be sent to advanced training. And my particular group of 120 individuals was selected to go to Camp Endicott in Davisville, Rhode Island, which was a Navy Seabee base. There, I arrived there, it must have been about October 1944. And we trained, and we also did advanced training where we assembled Quonset huts. It was at this particular base that the Quonset hut was established. It was created. The Seabees, of course, were part of the Navy. They were construction battalions, and they were attached to Marine divisions. And we were attached to the 4th Marine Division. Our training took place up until December 1944. And we did a lot of training with rifles and Brownie automatic rifles, where we did a lot of field training in the snow with parkas and winter gear. And we expected that we would be heading to Alaska.
And then what happened?
What happened, they surprised us.
Mm-hmm.
I was given a 3-day leave. This was in December, between December and New Year's, 1944 to 45. And I came home to New Britain, Connecticut to see my parents and also see my girlfriend. I had joined the Navy and she had joined the Nurse Corps. And I had a 3-day leave and visited with her. She was in training, nursing cadet training at the New Britain General Hospital. After returning after a 3-day leave to Camp Endicott, we were put aboard troop trains and sent across the country with all our parkas and all our winter gear and with the heavy Garand rifles and Browning automatic, and sent to Port Hueneme, California, which was a enormous CB base just above Los Angeles. At this particular CB base, we went into advanced training. There we spent several days training on landing craft. And nearby was the El Toro Marine Air Base, and they would fly over us very low, and we would land on the beaches and so forth. And then we also did rifle training. On our arrival there, they took us into a huge drill hall. In this drill hall, we still had our winter parkas, all our winter gear, and here we were in California, and we were told to remove everything and to put it in these boxes, and we would be issued new equipment and new clothing, which was for the tropics. And that's when we knew we were not going to go to Alaska.
So just like that, they changed their minds, huh?
Just like that, they changed their mind, and we found that our training was training towards the Pacific. But still, we did not know where the Pacific. It could be anywhere from the South Pacific to the Central Pacific and to the Western Pacific. And we were there for a period of maybe 3 weeks. And we were then sent to Treasure Island, which is a Navy base in the middle of the San Francisco Bay. And there we boarded a ship, and we're aboard ship and went aboard ship to Hawaii. In Hawaii, we were there, and we were wondering why we were waiting. We waited almost 2 days, and then a convoy was formed of about 14 ships, and we were part of the convoy. And then we left Pearl Harbor with several Navy ships, part of this convoy, and heading into the Western Pacific. But we had no idea of the islands we were going to, because everything was censored. All our mail was censored. Everything we wrote, we had to give to our censoring officer, and he would examine it, and you could not disclose what island you were at or what part of the Pacific you were at. You could not disclose your location. And we were sent to, first we stopped at the Marshall Islands, at Eniwetok and Kwajalein Islands. There was a huge lagoon. And at this particular lagoon, we were there, and several of the individuals who were CBs went ashore and were stationed there, were absorbed into a Marine division. The island had already been assaulted and was occupied by American forces. And so that group stayed there. We stayed there a day or two, and then we went to the Mariana Islands, to Guam. We stopped there, and in our particular convoy there, we were left with only 3 ships. Those 2 ships stayed at Guam, and we went the next day to Tinian Island in the Marianas, which was apparently our intended destination in the Western Pacific.
If we can just go back a little bit and fill in some background, and I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought,
Yeah.
because you're on a pretty good roll. I was just wondering if we could find, some of your memories. Do you have any? Do you remember any particularly memorable instructors from any of your earlier training before you were actually deployed?
In boot camp, which was initial training, there was a individual who was a principal from Oklahoma, and he looked like a movie actor, very handsome-looking individual, and he gave instructions about using rifles. And if you dropped your rifle, because we had manual arms, you had to move your rifle from one shoulder to the other shoulder, and sometimes a person would slip and lose his rifle. He would go wild and just berate the individual, and he would have to run around the drill field with the rifle over his head. And that was a good lesson to make sure you held onto your rifle.
I imagine.
Fortunately, when that happened in boot training, the rifles were not loaded. But the danger is if you had a loaded rifle and dropped, you could accidentally hit somebody with a bullet.
I guess it's better to prevent that, huh?
Yeah, that was intended to give you a lesson to make sure you held onto your rifle.
Were there any other instructors that stick out in your memory?
That one especially. There was another instructor who was teaching us in boot camp about abandoned ship drill. You had to go up this was in a huge drill hall, and you went up on a platform that was maybe 50 feet to the pool. And there were individuals in the pool, and there would be individuals on either side. And you were given the order that you would have to jump, and you were told how to hold your nose and everything else. And this was an abandoned ship drill, and there was an individual there right alongside you who said, "Take it easy, sailor. Just take a good breath and hold your hand under your arm and hold your nose and just keep your feet together," and so forth. And he tried to, and with that encouragement, you're able to do it. Otherwise, you're frightened as the dickens. It was a long way down to the water.
Did they work you up to 50 feet, or did they just start at 50
They
feet?
just started you there. It was a good leap.
That sounds tough.
About like leaping off the side of a aircraft carrier.
So there was a purpose behind it.
Yeah, there was a purpose behind it in case you were in a warfare zone and a ship was attacked, you would have to abandon ship, and that lesson that you learned how to do it correctly would probably save your life.
Indeed. So why did you pick the Navy?
I was fascinated by the Navy, reading books in the library. I was just fascinated by the fact that you could travel by ship to go to these different countries. And I just want to see these exotic ports. But what happened is they put me in the land Navy, in the Seabees, was part of the 4th Marine Division. I did see quite a bit in the Western Pacific, but I was not stationed aboard a ship as such, except for the trips that we took over, which were about 30 days aboard ship. But I got as fascinated with the Navy. Maybe it was being raised in Connecticut and going down to the shore and seeing all the ships and seeing all the yachts and so forth, and I just thought traveling around the world would be the right thing to do.
Did it live up to your expectations?
It did.
Nice.
It did. I can remember swaying in a hammock aboard this troop carrier out of Hawaii. They allowed us, because it was hot, very hot at night, even though the sun had set. It was about 80 degrees, 80, 85 degrees, and if you were down in a hole deep in a ship with another 3,000 men, it wasn't very pleasant. So they allowed you to take your hammock and string it up underneath the lifeboats. And I did that, and that was great. It was just like being rocked to sleep. And the only thing is, they used to have showers. And the shower, occasionally the shower would come, but if you were on the lifeboat correctly, you didn't get wet.
So did they have some sort of rotation, so different guys would be under the lifeboat at different times, or?
Well, the ship was big enough that individuals, you would get a spot and that you would hold it. Once you held it, if you weren't fortunate to get it. And then, of course, we had drills being in a convoy. There was danger of submarine attacks. So we would get along the rail. All individuals would have to be along the rail 1 hour before, 1/2 hour before sunrise, 1/2 hour before sunset. Because that's when the submarines would try to come in on the glistening water and hide their periscopes. And that was done every day. And we did that. We never saw any submarines. We didn't see any submarines. But we had to stay along the rail 1/2 hour before sunrise and 1/2 hour after just before sunset.
Now, was this the trip that ended you on Tinian Island?
Yes, this was from Pearl Harbor through the Marshall Islands and eventually to Tinian Island.
And what was it like arriving on Tinian Island?
Well, Tinian Island, when we arrived there, the island had already, the active engagement had taken place. The island was supposedly considered secure. Organized battles were not taking place. So when we arrived there, this island, Tinian Island, was in the shape of Manhattan Island. It was about 10 miles long and about 5.5 miles wide. It was a plateau type of island. It had 2 plateaus on it. It was primarily used by the Japanese who owned the island for sugarcane. And there was a small sugarcane factory on the island. Right next door, 1.5 miles away, was Saipan Island. These two were considered Northern Marianas Islands. And that was only about 1.5 miles across. There was this channel separating into 2 islands. Tinian, when we arrived, the island was still being developed. The roads were not completed. The harbor was not finished. And the desire was to bring the B-29 bombers, which were trying to reach Japan from China to Tinian Island into the Marianas, which would reduce their long flights. And so our duty was to construct an airfield on Tinian. In fact, 2 airfields, Northfield and Westfield. I had no engineering skills. I had no bulldozer skills. I could not operate a bulldozer or a crane or anything of that nature. So I was assigned to the harbor as a stevedore and a rigger, working on loading and unloading ship cargo. Being only 18 years old, with no other skills, this is the best thing they felt you were qualified for. And so most of my time was spent in the harbor. We worked 12-hour days and 13 days in a row. We would get 1 day off. There was nothing else to do on your day off because there was no place to go. The island was just all military. And though the Japanese, even though the island was considered not under active combat, in the sense that it was not organized, there were Japanese stragglers that would be taking pop shots and would occasionally try to come into the areas. And so we had guards on duty, and we had to be careful, especially we were on the edges of this tall, wild sugarcane. They would straggle through there and try to get into the various tents or Quonset huts to get food and so forth. And so we had to be surrounded with guards on duty all the time until everything got secure.
So they were basically stranded from their supply and the rest of their army, and they were just trying to make it through.
Yes.
Did
When the island was invaded, Tinian Island it was invaded in the north part of the island. And it did not have sandy beaches like you normally would see in Hawaii. They were limestone and coral. And there were cliffs, maybe some were 5 feet tall, some were 10, some were 15. But the island of Tinian, fortunately, because it was a plateau type of island, had only 2 beaches that were maybe about 100 yards wide. And those were the beaches that the Marines landed on with the Seabees. Saipan next door was a very volcanic type of island with huge cliffs, enormous cliffs, sheer cliffs, and deep ravines. But the Japanese on Tinian, after the Japanese thought that the Americans would come into the harbor area and the invasion, but instead we entered at north of the island, and they were so completely surprised, and then they withdrew to the south part of the island where there were huge ravines and caves, and they had stocked the caves, and they had a second defense line. So in moving back and forth, you had to be careful of ambushes. Because there were ambushes, and the area in the south part of the island was considered no man's land. We were asked not to go there because you could be ambushed, and it would be tragic.
Did you ever experience that? Did you ever experience any ambushes or hostile actions?
There was one. We had. I was in a truck that was moving from the harbor to the other side of the island, and we got hit by gunfire, and it smashed the windshield. It did smash the windshield. We were carrying cargo going to an Air Corps unit. We're going to bring something to the Air Corps unit. And of course, what we had to do is report this to the military police. So we got the military police, and they made us go back to the area that this happened in. And they came with a couple dozen Marine combat troops, and they went into the area looking for these individuals who maybe were firing. The Japanese, because they had the initial plan is if they could not stop the invasion, they withdrew to the caves. And these caves were covered by vines and jungle, and then there was razor grass, which would cut you terribly if you went in there. So everybody avoided that area. And those that didn't, there were some that didn't. They went in there looking for souvenirs, and tragically some of them did not make it.
Come back. So you never engaged the Japanese, but if
I
you
did
got
not.
shot at, you
Right.
would.
I was not in any organized combat.
Okay.
Organized, what you would consider organized
Right.
combat.
But I mean, it sounds to me like none of the U.S. forces on this island really actively engaged. You know, if you were shot at, you wouldn't stop and fire back. You would continue on and send
Yes.
reinforcements back.
Right. If you were being fired at, you would fire back. But if you just had somebody shoot at you, your duty was to report this to the military police, and it was their job to seek out and change that area. Because the island was considered secure.
Mm-hmm.
It was considered secure, and your duty was to handle cargo, and their duty was to provide security.
Now, you were telling me earlier that the Seabees never existed before Pearl Harbor. Can you tell us more about that for the record?
On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor took place.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Navy had this great duty. They knew that they would be called upon to develop installations throughout the Pacific, in the South Pacific, in the Western Pacific, and so forth. They would have to build airfields, they would have to build harbors, they would have to build barracks, they would have to build all sorts of installations. But the Navy at that time depended upon civilian labor. Their primary duties were shipboard, aboard ship, and they were not trained to do any of those other construction duties. There were 3 individuals who went, 2 of them went to Rensselaer Polytech outside of Albany, New York. One was called Ben Morrell. He was the admiral who was considered the father of the Seabees. He had two officers that worked under him, and they were charged with the duty of developing a construction and installation battalion, and that would support the Navy when their duties were in the Western Pacific. And the Seabees were formed in March 1942 in Davisville, Rhode Island, Camp Endicott, and that is considered the birthplace of the Seabees. And they were primarily individuals who had special skills, engineering skills, and construction skills, and could operate bulldozers and cranes, and could do work on harbors. And many of those individuals that were in the initial group were very senior. They were already married individuals who had families, would have been exempt from joining the service. They would have been exempt, but being a patriotic time, they joined. And many of them did wonderful things because it was their ability to construct these installations that made it possible for us to move from island to island and eventually defeat Japan.
So were they given standard military training? Were they trained on rifles and...
Yes,
machine
everybody had to go through what we call boot camp. Everybody had to go through boot camp, which is the initial instruction and duties you would do as a seaman, or some of them came in with a higher rank, but all had to have duty. All had to know how to handle weapons, because if you ever came to an experience where there would be an assault and overwhelm, you had to, if you were a cook or a baker, you still had to know how to handle a weapon.
So, tell me about your most memorable experiences.
One of the most memorable experiences was when I arrived on Tinian Island. At that time, we were building our outfit was involved in building the runways on what is called North Field. This was a 4-runway airfield. And we were also building 2 runways on Westfield. When the construction on Northfield was completed, and it was decided that the B-29 four-engine super bombers, super fortresses, which were then in China, and were trying to reach Japan from China, and they were having 16-hour flights and wrecking their engines. The design to invade and occupy the Marianas was to bring all those aircraft to those islands, Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. Primarily on Tinian, because Tinian was a plateau type of island. They could build this huge Northfield, which held up to 350 B-29s. So when I arrived on the island, the construction had not yet been completed on Northfield, but it was finally completed in February 1945. And that's when B-29 started to fly in, the huge group that came in from China. And others came in from the United States. And that's when writing home to my mother, we were allowed, after we were on Tinian Island for 30 days, to identify that we were in the Western Pacific and in the Marianas. And when I did write home, my mother wrote back and said that she was talking with a neighbor and that her son had been transferred to Tinian Island. And he was in the Air Force, and he was a tail gunner on a B-29 bomber. So when I received a letter, and his name was Stanley Poplawski from New Britain, and in fact Stanley is considered the most highly decorated individual from the city of New Britain. He joined the service in the Air Force before Pearl Harbor. And he was there at Henderson Field when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and he survived that attack. But he was then a B-17 bomber tail gunner, and he was sent to the South Pacific, where the Japanese were attempting to invade Australia. And in aircraft fights there, he was wounded 3 times. He was credited with shooting down 2 Japanese aircraft. He received numerous decorations. And when I received the letter, I didn't know him at all, but I wanted to meet him. So I went to Northfield to the enlisted men's canteen, and I asked about him, and they knew who he was, but they said he was on a mission over Japan that day, and he would be back that evening between 6 and 8 o'clock, and I returned, and I met him. And it was just overwhelming to meet somebody from your own neighborhood who knew everybody that you knew, thousands of miles away from home. That was a memorable occasion.
So did you guys spend a lot of time together? Did you become friends?
We did. Because being in the Seabees, where we had control of all sorts of supplies, and we had the best equipment, we had the best trucks, we had the best food. I invited him over to have, when he had free time, not on missions, to come over to eat in our drill hall, in our mess hall. And he invited me to come to Northfield, and I took 2 trips on a B-29 bomber. Not missions over Japan. One was a mission where they had overhauled the engine on the B-29, and they had to test it to make sure it was properly working. And he got permission from the commander of the aircraft that I would be allowed to go aboard, and that was thrilling. we flew out over the Pacific towards Guam and Truk Island, and that was something I'll never forget. And then about 2 or 3 weeks later, he said, "Would you like to go again?" I said, "Yes." He says, "We're testing the Bombay doors on the particular aircraft." He said, "We're testing them. They hadn't been operating correctly." And he said, "We're going to have a test flight. Would you like to go?" I said, "Oh, gosh, yeah." So he took me aboard then.
Nice.
So that was, those were high points. High points in being on Tinian
Did you
Island.
guys maintain a friendship after you got out?
Yes, we did, and I do have a lot of information about him as an individual who he not only served in the B-17, B-29, as I mentioned, he was a most highly decorated individual. He was so highly decorated, the Air Force selected him to represent them at Pearl Harbor when President Clinton was at Pearl Harbor to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he represented the Air Force, and he was in the receiving line.
That's pretty prestigious.
Yeah, very much so. And we wrote letters back and forth. He moved to Green Bay, Wisconsin, and he passed away at age 88 just 2 years ago. And there was a huge write-up in the New Britain Herald about him, and I have a copy of it here, and it's something I can give to you that you can take.
Well, let's kind of keep the story on you. Was there anything that you did for good luck while you were in the Pacific?
For good luck to make sure.
Yeah.
Well, one thing they did, they warned us not to go souvenir hunting into this area, which was no man's land, and that was good luck. That was good luck because there were some that didn't follow those orders, and they tragically didn't make it because some of the things were booby trapped and so forth. The other thing, I think I had good luck. We had air raids. The Japanese bombers tried to destroy the harbor because they knew the aircraft that were bombing Japan were coming from these islands. And so we would have air raids, maybe every other night, sometimes 2 a night. And I was on a night shift from 6 at night to 6 in the morning. And there were many times that we would just hear explosions and we wouldn't hear an air raid siren. And we would run up into bunkers to be protected. And so I consider myself very lucky that I was not injured in any of those air raids.
So that was actually enemy activity, and they never sounded the air raid, huh?
No, there were some false alarms. But every night the Air Force on Tinian had what they call P-61 night fighters, Black Widow night fighters. And there was a squadron of a dozen. And these were like P-38 split tail fighters. And they had a night fighter, radar, and so forth. And they would come fly out every evening over the south part of the island, heading towards Guam and Truk Island. And another group apparently must have gone from Saipan to protect it from the north. And occasionally we would see flashes in the sky over the Pacific, where they had shot down enemy aircraft and protected us from enemy aircraft coming and bombing the harbor and bombing also North Field. And that continued for quite a while. And sometimes they would come in the evening, and sometimes they'd come early in the morning. And catch you completely unawares. But we were very well protected by the Air Force with these night fighters. They were great.
And they would stay out all night?
They would be out all night. They would fly out all night. They would fly out all night. And groups, they would go in groups of three. There would be three, maybe 6 or 9. And then they would stay out all night patrolling outside and try to intercept any bombers that were heading towards the island.
That sounds like it would make you sleep a little
Yeah.
better at night.
Yeah. And then, of course, there was another experience that happened at North Field where a Japanese submarine surfaced between the two islands and bombarded with its deck gun Saipan and Tinian and destroyed a couple of B-29s. We didn't know of this until we heard of explosions. We were working, heard of explosion. We didn't know what it was all about. And then later on, because everything was very much censored and you couldn't get any information from anyone, we didn't learn of it until about 3-4 days after it had taken place.
How did your guys entertain themselves?
We were fortunate. What they did have is they built outdoor movie theaters, which was just a screen and a stage, like a stage, screen and stage. And they would have movies that would be sent from one outfit to the other. You would trade movies, and that was primarily it. And then there occasionally would be movies of news movies. But of course, news at that time was very much censored, and news was not very specific and detailed. It was just given in a general way. But we did have news of what was going on in the United States. And that's the way we got news of, I recall getting news of President Roosevelt's death when he died. And we got it we heard it over the Armed Forces radio, and we also saw it on a movie. Pathé News, I think it was called Pathé News.
Did you ever have entertainers?
Yes, there were entertainers that came to the Air Force, primarily to the Air Force, and we would, Navy men were not excluded. We would try to get there, and we did see some of them. And we do know that to Saipan, an adjoining island, I think it was Bing Crosby. No, it was Bob Hope. It was Bob Hope, actually, came to Saipan. And there were individuals that learned of it in our outfit, and they wanted to go there, but they wouldn't give them permission because you had to go out, and the island was about 2 miles separated them, but it was open ocean. And so Bob Hope went to Saipan and entertained the troops.
Did you guys ever pull pranks on each other?
Oh, yes. What was done a lot of was individuals who would... there was a very famous thing that took place during World War II having to do with Kilroy. The story of Kilroy. Individuals would write in the depths of a ship, all the way in the bottom of a ship, Kilroy was here. You would go to a mess hall, and it would be written, Kilroy was here. Kilroy became very famous during World War II. And there's quite a story about how this all happened. And it happened in both the American European Theater and the American Asiatic Pacific Theater. Individuals were right in the most unusual place. Kilroy was here. You would find it on bombs, you would find it on aircraft, you would find it in the Bombay, Kilroy was here. What the story is that Kilroy, they developed in Massachusetts in building naval ships. And Kilroy was an individual who had to test the welding and the bolts that were put in to make sure that they was done correctly. And when he tested all these bolts, he would physically have to go and crawl through the ship and make sure it was done right. And so he would put a check mark, Kilroy, and he wrote Kilroy, and his name was Kilroy. And then it was just copied by others. And it was just a big prank that developed, and it was the most hilarious thing of World War II.
That's funny. Did you know anybody who ever wrote Kilroy anything? Did you yourself?
No, I didn't, but I did see in the Armed Forces newsletter different things that they would find. Kilroy's name, they would show a picture of Kilroy written on the bottom of a tank, and he was there on the bottom of a tank. But we saw it inside cargo ships when we were loading cargo. We did see it on there, so it was just a prank.
That's funny. What did you think of your commanding officers and your fellow soldiers?
They were first class. We were very fortunate in our small unit of maybe about 120 individuals, because I was attached to that section of the 121st Naval Construction Battalion that was in charge of cargo at the harbor in Tinian. And we had a lieutenant commander who was from Annapolis graduate, and we also had a lieutenant who was also an Annapolis graduate, and we had 2 warrant officers and an ensign. And they were very great men and very reasonable men, and it was a pleasure to be with them. It really was. And when you're only 18 years old, taking orders from somebody who has had college and had naval experience was something you did, and you respected them very much.
So, if I'm hearing you right, it sounded like you rather looked up to these guys.
Yes, you did. You did look up to them because, and they were not individuals that pulled rank on you or gave you direct orders or so forth. He said, "Don't you think you should do it that way, sailor, or should you do it this way?" But in the Navy, when you're working on a particular project, say you're involved with something, and an officer appears in your work area, the first thing, the one person that first sees the officer is required to say, "Attention, officer on deck." So whatever you're doing, you drop and you stand up and you recognize the officer. And in the Seabees, the Seabees had a motto called "Can Do." Can do. And in fact, the Seabees, I'm also besides Veterans of Foreign Wars, an American Legion, I'm a member of the Seabees of America. And their magazine is called the Can Do. And when an officer would give you command in the service, you would say, "Aye, aye, sir," when you were aboard ship. And in the Navy, in the Seabees, an officer would give command, "Well, you individuals clean up that area there. Can do, sir. Can do, sir." And that would be a response. And it's still apparently done today, I understand, in the military, because the Seabees are active in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And they are attached to Marine divisions there. And occasionally you will see where some has been tragically killed while doing his duty.
Did you keep a personal diary?
No, I
No diary?
didn't. I didn't keep a personal diary. I wrote a lot of letters home and received quite a few letters back. But I did not keep a personal diary as such. What I do have some letters that I wrote then to my girlfriend, who eventually became my wife. When I came back, discharged from the service, we got married when I was going to college.
Right after?
Well, a year after my freshman year, I was married after my freshman year, and she went. I took then my girlfriend, who was then my wife. We went to Vermont, where I went to college in Vermont, and then came back to Connecticut, and moved into Simsbury. First, we came back to New Britain, and then eventually moved here to Simsbury.
Did you know you were going to marry her when you were together before the war?
Yes. At that time, in fact, before I went overseas, we were engaged. We were engaged. Before I went overseas, we became engaged. It was quite a few individuals were married before they were separated and the person had to go and serve his duty. I had an aunt who married an individual who joined the Air Force and was stationed in England in the 8th Air Force. And she married him before he was sent overseas. And I went with her. I was then 16 years old in high school. And I went with her and her mother down to Miami, Florida by train, where she was married in a chapel there in Miami Beach, Air Force Chapel. And she stayed there for, I think it was about 4 days, and then came back by train, but her husband went overseas and served at the 8th Air Force.
Wow. So how did you end your military career?
Well, I think what I'd like to mention, just this point on Tinian Island.
Please.
Tinian Island became very famous during World War II. From the bombings that were taking place over the Japanese, of course, were preparing for getting ready for a land invasion by us. The United States was going to land invade them. And we were hopeful that the bombing by the B-29s from the Mariana Islands, Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, would so destroy their ability to wage war that they would surrender, unconditional surrender. And the bombings went on relentlessly from January, heaviest from January 1945 until August 1945. Then, of course, the United States developed the atomic bomb in New Mexico, and it was tested July of 1945, and the atomic bomb was delivered to Tinian Harbor. It was delivered by the heavy cruiser Indianapolis. The heavy cruiser is like a battleship. It was a large cruiser. It appeared in the harbor overnight. Overnight it appeared in the harbor. And we saw it there. We had no idea what its mission was. And this was July 1945. The military police took control of the harbor. They sealed off the harbor. And we were told that there was going to be no unloading or cargo handling that day. And they came with Air Force military police, and they escorted the scientists and the trigger to the bomb to North Field, which was then completed, from which we were bombing Japan. And in a very secluded part on North Field, unknown to any of us, was the Enola Gay, which was the B-29 selected to carry the B-29. They carried the atomic bomb. And it was from North Field on Tinian Island that the B-29 took off with the atomic bomb. And the second aircraft that took off with the atomic bomb 3 days later, I think it was Bockscar, I think it was B-O-C-K-S, Bockscar, was also on Tinian Island. But the way the bomb was delivered, it was delivered, the trigger of the bomb came aboard the Indianapolis. The bomb itself, the huge bomb, came aboard a B-29 from Hawaii. And it was assembled after the aircraft left the island and on its trip to Japan. It was assembled in flight because they were not sure they were just amazed at the power of the atomic bomb in Mexico. Of course, all this was known after it took place. While it was going place, we had no idea. I was in the south part of the island and everything was censored. We had no idea this was going on at all.
How did it make you feel when you found out?
We were amazed because our first knowledge was on Saipan was a Army, Air Force, Armed Services radio station. It would come on at 1 o'clock every day. And it would give you 10 to 15 minutes of news. News from Europe in a very generic way that American forces were moving in France and they were heading towards Germany and so forth, and activity was very in the Air Force, 8th Air Force. They would give information of that nature, and then they would get something that may have been going on in Congress or something of that nature. When the atomic bomb was dropped, our first knowledge was through the Armed Forces station on Saipan. It came on that day, and it just said in a generic way that today a single B-29 aircraft from the Marianas delivered a new weapon called an atomic bomb and dropped this weapon on the city of Hiroshima. And its explosion was devastating to the city, and huge destruction took place. All aircraft returned from this mission. And that was the whole thing. They did not mention Tinian, did not mention North Field, did not mention Enola Gay. It was all intended because it was all censored. And that was the most information we ever got. But just to further mention, so that's where the atomic bomb was assembled, and that's where the trigger. Another part to this story is the Indianapolis heavy cruiser that delivered the atomic bomb. After it delivered it in July 1945, the end of July, it went to Guam overnight. It stayed in Guam. Then it was on a journey to the Philippines. After it had left Guam, about after midnight, I think it was on July 31st, 1945, a single Japanese submarine hit it with 3 torpedoes. And it hit the magazine and it blew the ship in half. The ship sunk in 12 minutes. 300 were killed in the initial explosion. 900 others survived in the water. But it was 4 days before the Navy realized that the ship was missing and had been sunk. And of the 900 others, 600 died from exposure and from shark attacks, and only 300 survived. That was the greatest loss of one ship of the Navy ever in World War II. But it would have been tragic had it been sunk before it reached Tinian, because the trigger to the atomic bomb was aborted, and maybe we never would have used the atomic bomb, and we maybe were forced to invade Japan, and it would have been a tremendous tragedy for both the Japanese and for the Americans.
So when the Armed Service Radio broadcasted that the U.S. had a new weapon and that they had used it successfully, how did that make you? What did you guys think? You and your men think about how the war was going after that?
Well, we were amazed when we heard that. We said, how could they? And they did say this, though. The atomic bomb had the explosion capacity of 20,000 tons of TNT. That was a crucial statement that was with this announcement. We just couldn't envision 20,000 tons of TNT. How could that one B-29 carry? It had to be big as a boxcar. We just kept talking about it. It had to be as large as a boxcar. We just couldn't envision how one B-29 could carry that big a load. It carried 5 tons. I think its capacity was 10,000 pounds, 5 tons. So we were then wondering, gee whiz, if it took off from North Field, how could they have carried it? And one of the individuals finally said, well, the runways are side by side. They got a 4-engine B-29 here and a 4-engine B-29 there, and you put a hammock or sling in between them, you put the bomb there, and you take off. That's the only way we could envision. We had no idea what atomic bomb meant. We had no idea of. That was the first time we had ever heard the word. And that was the conclusion we reached. That was carried between 2 4-engine B-29s.
So what was the process after the second bomb?
Then after the second bomb, we heard several days that the Japanese, over Armed Forces Radio, that the Japanese had notified Washington, D.C. that they were willing to accept their surrender terms. And that was August, 14th, 12th or 14th, 1945. So for all purposes, the war was over. But the actual signing of the surrender documents on the battleship Missouri didn't take place until September 2nd. But during that period of time, there were many Japanese. The Japanese military did not want to accept surrender. In fact, when the emperor was going to agree to surrender, Japanese emperor, after he saw the devastation from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he toured and he saw the civilians were just in terrible, terrible pain, and there was terrible loss of life, and it all happened to the civilians. And up till then, the military were telling them and telling him that we can survive, that we can overcome anything. And he concluded, we can't. All the individuals here have lost. And he decided that he was going to make a radio tape and make an announcement to the public that we will accept what is tremendously painful. We will accept surrender, and we will not continue the war any longer. He made this tape, and this tape was prepared, and he was going to put it on the radio the next day. In his military security guard was a Japanese captain who the military did not want to surrender at all. They saw defeat as there was the military code, the Japanese military code was one of victory or death. there was no surrender in your code. You either won the battle, or you died in the battle, or you committed suicide.
Kind of
So-
the old samurai code, as it were.
Yeah, the samurai code was that. So the Japanese captain, he went to the colonel who was in charge of the security of the emperor in the emperor's palace, and he told the emperor, we cannot allow this to happen. We must find and destroy that tape. And the colonel told him the emperor had decided, and we are to be obedient to his orders. And the captain killed the colonel, took over the security guard, and searched the palace to find the tape. And faithful soldiers came into the security place, and they were trying to overcome so they wouldn't do this. Obviously, the emperor had already made a decision, and there was a battle between the two, and the captain was killed and several others. But they never found the tape and never destroyed it, and the next day it was put on the radio, and the Japanese, hearing the emperor's voice, accepted defeat. Of course, this is all unknown. We know it now, but while this was going on, none of us realized it.
So how much longer after that was it before you received orders that you were going home?
Well, the way the decommissioning was taking place, individuals who had the longest service points, what they called points, for every month of service, you received supposedly 2 points. Every month of service overseas, every month of service overseas, you got like 2 points. So whether you were in a combat service or it just had to be out of the United States, and you were called back based on how many points you had. And so those who were first out in the Western Pacific were the ones that were recalled first and came back to the United States. Because our outfit had we had people on Saipan and people on Tinian. We had the construction battalion had two particular locations. It was decided that we would combine the two and move individuals together, and so I went to Saipan. We went out into landing craft, and this was in September. The signing of the Japanese signed on the Missouri the document of surrender. And it was in January of 1946 that we combined the two battalions, and we became stationed on Saipan. I stayed on Saipan while we were decommissioning. Outfits were releasing to us their equipment, their trucks, their jeeps, all sorts of other equipment that we had to, that equipment that was going to be saved would be put aboard ship and sent back to the United States. But all trucks and jeeps and all that equipment was told to the United States manufacturing firms, equipment that is military vehicles would not come back to the United States. Otherwise, they would destroy our American manufacturing ability. So they were guaranteed by the government they would not send back. And in the Philippines, left behind and sold in the Philippines was something like 5 million Jeeps. There were so many there. And many of the equipment that we had was sent to the Philippines also, because it was considered a friendly country of ours and still part of the United States that had not separated from the United States. And so a lot of the equipment, especially trucks, jeeps, anything, even cranes, we sent cranes over, and bulldozers, but things like but there were like tanks and so forth. Those were sent too as well. And the islands they sent an awful lot to the Philippines.
So you were essentially kind of a collections officer.
Yes, we were collecting from outfits that were being decommissioned. What they did is they became decommissioned, and their duty was to get back to the United States. And so we took possession of a lot of, and it was mostly naval stuff. The Air Force stuff, the Army had their own engineers that took possession of that. But we provided support for the equipment. There was naval equipment.
So does that mean that you were the last to leave, essentially?
Well, we didn't have enough points. The individuals who were there earlier, so I didn't leave there until it was like, it was just before Memorial Day, 1946. Just before Memorial Day, 1946. We boarded this troop carrier, and from this troop carrier we went to the island of Peleliu first. The island of Peleliu, where a tremendous battle, a very tragic battle took place there, and we went there and we picked up groups of Marines that were there and other Seabees. We went to Guam and then we went to Peleliu. First we went to Guam, then Peleliu, and from Peleliu we bypassed even Pearl Harbor and the ship went wide open from Peleliu all the way to Treasure Island in San Francisco. Going overseas, I think it took us like 28 days or almost 30 days. Going back, I think we did it in about 12 or 14.
In a hurry to get home, huh?
Yeah, in a hurry to get home.
And what did you do in the period after you arrived home, in the weeks and days after arrival?
Well, when I arrived home and came to Treasure Island, they sent you by troop train across the country, and you had to report to the naval base on the East Coast, and I reported to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The Brooklyn Navy Yard was a huge installation. In fact, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, I think, built the last American battleship. The last American battleship that was built was the Massachusetts, and I think that was built at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was a huge installation. And there, when you reported to Brooklyn Navy Yard, they gave you leave. You could go home on 15-day leave. So I got aboard a train in Grand Central Station and headed north and arrived in Berlin, Connecticut. Actually, in Berlin, Connecticut, that's where I met my parents and my girlfriend. And that came home on a 15-day leave, and that was in June 1945. Yes, that was June 1945. And after 15 days at home and meeting everybody and so forth, I had to report back, and I stayed at Brooklyn Navy Yard. I think we were there 2 days. 2 days. Then they sent us to Lido Beach, Long Island, which was a huge recreational area that the Navy had taken over. And at Lido Beach, we were what they call, went through the process of separation. This is several days where they interviewed you about your physical condition. They interviewed you about benefits. They gave you an idea what benefits would be available to you. Of course, the GI Bill. They also explained to you about insurance, whether you wanted to continue your insurance. And there was an officer there, and that GI insurance, and I continued it, and I still have it as of today. I was 19, so I've had the GI insurance from 1944 up until today. So that's best bargain I ever had.
Not bad.
Best bargain I ever had. Haven't paid any premiums for over 30 years. And the benefits keep increasing.
Nice. Did you end up going to school?
I did. I came home and discharged in July. I think it was July. And then, of course, before I started to inquire about college, I initially wanted to enroll in either Trinity College or Wesleyan. And when I went to get my transcript at New Britain High School, I was informed that enrollments had been already completed at those colleges. You're just too late. And I said, oh my gosh, I'll have to wait a whole year. And when I came home and gave the news to my parents, they were shocked. And they said, oh, you should be going to college. You can't wait a year. And my mother mentioned that an individual I played football with on New Britain Senior High School football team in 1940. This would be 1941. We played football together. Was released from the Navy earlier in the year, like in April, and his mother told my mother that he was going to go to college in Vermont. And my mother said, well, why didn't you go see him? Why didn't you go see him? You played football together, and maybe you can go to college with him. So I did. And I ended up with him going to Vermont. Went to college there at St. Michael's College in Vermont and graduated in June 1950.
What'd you study?
I studied business administration and finance. Business administration and finance. And then after my freshman year, I came back home, and my girlfriend, who had joined the nurse corps, and they had released her because the service did not want to commission them all as second lieutenants, all the nurses. So they released them at convenience of the government. So she did not complete her nursing degree at New Britain General Hospital. But eventually she got her nursing degree from St. Francis Hospital, where she did it on her own. But she was released from the service, and we got married in 1947 after my freshman year, and she came with me to Vermont, and we lived on campus. And our oldest daughter was born on campus, and then came back. They came back to Connecticut and lived in New Britain for a while, and eventually moved to Simsbury, and I've been in Simsbury now 52 years.
And your education was completely supported by the GI Bill?
It was.
Very nice.
The greatest legislation ever invented. Created the middle class. You couldn't imagine that when the officer at separation was saying, you can go to college and we'll pay you to go to college. You just couldn't believe that they would pay you money to go to college. Amazing. But you would get, I think it was a month, some say a month and a half. I think it was like 2 months. For every month of service, you got 2 months of education, fully paid for. Fully paid for. Whether you were overseas or whether you just served the United States. So some say it was a month and a half, but my recollection is it was 2 months. And so if you had 18 months of service, you would get 36 months of college. You get a 4-year degree. And the only thing was that you were not paid during the summer months. You weren't paid June, July, and August. You had to get a job and you to receive anything, but you were not going to college. So you got a summer job. But otherwise, you received so much per month. I think if you were single, it was like $72 a month. Then if you got married, I think it went up to like $90 a month. And then if you had a child, I think you got like $96 a month. And then if you had another child, you got like $100 a month. I do recall it going up, but after the second child, I think that was it.
That was it. They capped it.
Yeah, but it was, the GI Bill was the greatest legislation ever invented, for which we have to thank President Franklin Roosevelt, the American Legion, and the Veterans of Foreign War. The three of them got together and they created the GI Bill. And we're benefiting from it right now today.
Nice. Earlier you had mentioned Stanley Poplawski.
Yeah.
Other than him, did you make any other close friendships while you were in the service?
There was another individual who lived in Rhode Island who was involved in ship stores. He was involved in ship stores, and I remember going to visit him. He was older than I was. I was 18, 19, eventually 19. He was married, had joined the service, and his specialty was machine work, and so he worked in a machine shop. And because he was from Rhode Island, the two of us somehow got attracted together and at Davisville, and we spent time overseas, and then we got discharged. I remember going to visit him after being home. I remember visiting him and writing letters and Christmas cards, as I did with Stanley Poplawski, as I did with Stanley.
Nice. So you made pretty much 2 lifelong friends from your military experience.
Yes, very, very much so. 2 lifelong friends, and they're both gone now. But they were. Stanley was a rare individual who was not at all. I didn't learn of all his medals and awards until after he had been released from the service and sent home. He was sent home, and then I went to the base, and I knew he was leaving. And then once I went to the base to see one of his friends there, and he said, well, the reason they sent him home, they were thinking that they did not want to lose him in battle. They did not want him because he was so highly decorated, and his luck could run out. So he was sent back, and when the war was ended with Japan, he was in the United States, was going to train additional people who would be sent overseas. So he was sent back to the United States to train individuals.
You mentioned a couple of them earlier. Did you join any other veterans organizations after you got out of the service?
The only organizations I really stayed with was the American Legion. I'm still a member. I was an officer in the American Legion, and now I'm a judge advocate, a former judge advocate. And then currently I'm a member of the Simsbury Veterans of Foreign Wars, and I'm a judge advocate there, an officer position. And then I'm also a member of the Seabees of America, which is an outfit located in Torrington, Connecticut. And I'm also a member of the U.S. Navy Memorial, which is in Washington, D.C. And my wife and I were both members, charter members of the World War II Memorial, which was recently built. We built in the last 3-4 years. And we were charter members, both of us.
Very nice. What did you end up doing for a career after the war?
Well, after the war, I came, after after college, returned to Connecticut, and I was hired working for the Aetna Life and Casualty. I was hired working with them, and spent my entire career with them. Over 40 some odd years, almost 42 years. I worked in different offices with the Aetna. I was always in insurance and insurance claims. I went to law school in the evenings under the GI Bill. Well, this was before the University of Connecticut University of Connecticut Law School was established. There was the College of Law in Hartford, and I went there for 2 years, evening division, and exhausted my GI Bill, and thereafter we wanted to build a home and so forth, so I didn't spend any more money on tuition, and instead we built a home and moved to Simsbury.
So not only did the government pay for your education, but they paid for part of your house as well.
Yeah, they did.
Wow.
They guaranteed the mortgage and so forth. They guaranteed the mortgage. And so I'm eternally grateful
Yeah.
because I was immensely rewarded for my service. Immensely rewarded.
Well, I think you pretty much touched on my next question then. But how has your military experience influenced your thinking about war or about the military in general?
War needs to be the last resort in all circumstances. Preemptive war needs to be condemned and should not be even thought of as a doctrine or considered. Defensive war, where a country needs to defend themselves, as we did in World War II. We were for no reason attacked, and we had to defend ourselves. That is the war you can use under all circumstances. The same has happened here at 9/11. Tragic as it was, because the war there was against civilians. It was not a war, a military war. World War II was military to military. The wars we see today is people, the most innocent civilians are singled out for the most cruelest of all treatment. And they are unarmed and untrained, and yet that is happening so many places. It's tragic, it's tragic. But we need to defend ourselves whenever we are attacked, and we were attacked. And our response has been proper. Although I do believe the concentration should have been in the area of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we made a tremendous, terrible blunder by going to Iraq. Terrible. And that was offensive war, which I think needs to be condemned.
I can't make any comments on that. Might be a little too political for this interview, you know. Not the purpose of the Veterans History
Yeah.
Project. So, in what other ways has your service and experiences affected your life?
Well, the service for meeting individuals who all working with a common mission. You work with a common mission and you each support each other. You learn later on when you're in industry or your other parts that you are not an island, that you can't do things on your own, that you are dependent upon others and others are dependent upon you, and that there is a need to be cooperative and tolerant. That's the other thing. You have to be tolerant of the differences that you see, because only through accepting the differences, are we able to complete a common mission. That said, the greatest benefit to me from military service was the GI Bill. And I think it was the greatest benefit to our country. Had we not had the GI Bill, I don't believe today we would have a middle class. The GI Bill opened up the universities to individuals who couldn't even imagine that they would ever be able to afford it, especially with large families. My brother, who was younger than I was a Marine both in World War II and in Korea, and he got all his education on the GI Bill. My two brother-in-laws, both of them received the GI Bill, both of them. My father was a World War I veteran. World War I veteran. Didn't serve overseas because the war ended before he was sent overseas. And my father-in-law was a World War I veteran. But the benefits I received in World War II were tremendous compared to what they received. And I'm hopeful that the same thing will be done for the veterans who are now serving in defense of our country. And I have read the new GI Bill that was recently passed and signed by President Bush here, I think June 30th, and which is a huge improvement over what was between World War II and now. This bill it'll be implemented, I believe, next year. Will provide benefits to individuals so they won't have to borrow money in order to complete their education, and provide them with sufficient funds so they will be able to meet their needs. And then, if they decide not to participate, their credits that will be built up from being in a service, I think if you're in a service like for 10 years, you can transfer that to anyone you wish in your family, maybe to others. So if that person doesn't participate, he can give it to his children. And they can, on his record, service record, get the GI Bill, which I think is a wonderful opportunity.
Sounds like a nice arrangement.
Yeah,
Definitely.
nice arrangement. This was recently passed by the Congress and approved by President Bush.
Now you mentioned that you learned a lot about the ability to work, utilize teamwork to achieve goals and tolerate the differences between different groups of people. How do you think that relates to today's generations?
I believe individuals, when you're, this is something I didn't have when I graduated from high school. I didn't have that interaction training. I didn't have that interaction experience. I do believe that there is a benefit that could benefit people from high school. Some that would extremely benefit their future life and improve their future life by going into the service. Service, there are some countries like Switzerland and Israel and so forth where you're required to do that after high school. And I do believe that that would benefit a lot of young people. Yes, you would benefit from it because you then learn interaction with others. You earn toleration. You earn that in order to meet a mission and to meet an objective, you each have to support each other. Because up till then, you haven't developed that type of a skill, because you haven't had exposure to it. So I do believe that service, maybe not all individuals like the military service, but it does teach you to be on time, to be ready, and to listen to commands and to respond without question. That your duty is to do and follow orders. And once you learn that, and you learn a regimental type of atmosphere, it'll help you through the rest of your life. It really will. And now, especially since they've enhanced the GI Bill so that the benefits are tremendous, I think it's a step in the right direction that you can now enroll in your state university, or you can enroll in any college in your state, and you will be paid tuition at the highest rate charged by any state university. If you were selected a private university, and the private university, say in Connecticut, charges $40,000 a year, but Central Connecticut State University charges $35,000, you will get paid at $35,000 because that's the highest rate of a state university. You're short $5,000 if you go to that $40,000 university, but you're not prevented from going there. If you want to spend that additional $5,000, fine. If you want to get in debt, but that is a wonderful approach to this particular thing. And I think the president of Dartmouth College was one of the individuals that had a great deal of say-so in designing this new GI Bill of Rights. He was on the committee, and he gave the academic approach to it, how it would benefit students, and they apparently followed his suggestion.
Nice.
One thing I like to mention about, I mentioned about Kilroy was here all over the service. You get strange things, and we we arrived at Tinian Island. When we arrived at Tinian Island, and then we got exposed to the Armed Forces radio, which was in the adjoining island of Saipan, and would come on every day at 1 o'clock and give us 10, 15 minutes of news. But before the news would start and so forth, it would start. This is the Armed Forces radio reporting from Marpy Point Country Club on the gorgeous island of Saipan, overlooking the blue Pacific Ocean. And in the background you would hear ladies' voices, women's voices laughing, and you would hear splashing of water and so forth, and then you would hear somebody say, "Waiter, please, I would like to have another cocktail, please." "Oh yes, waiter, waiter." And you would hear this background noise, and here you were on this island, and you said, "Oh my gosh, on this adjoining island they have a country club, and they are swimming and they're serving cocktails the afternoon." And then the reporter would come on and say, "We're reporting from Marpy Point Country Club, and we are reporting right here from the deck of the swimming pool. And as you can hear in the background, some people are enjoying the day and enjoying the nice weather and so forth. But we're going to report to you what the news of the world is," and so forth. They get into the news of the world. Then everybody in the Pacific would hear this, in the Western Pacific, and would think, "Oh my gosh, isn't that wonderful? They got a country club there, and they're having a great time." So everybody was interested, when they got to Saipan, to find this country club. Wow. When you went to Marpy Point, which was a huge 200-foot cliff, sheer cliff on Saipan, all there was a tent and an individual sitting in a tent at a little place there with a microphone, and that's all that the Marpy Point Country Club was. And that was one of the greatest deceiving things of World War II. And that but everybody was interested in getting to see Saipan and Tinian Island, Saipan Island, and the Marpy Point Country Club.
So, how did you react when you found out?
Oh, we were shocked.
Yeah.
I remember, and this was about 6 months after the war was over, when we were all assembled on Saipan, and we took a jeep and went up there, and drove up there, and the fellow was broadcasting, and he was broadcasting from the tent. He says, "Gee whiz," we asked somebody, "Well, where's the country club here?" He says, "You're the second group of guys that have been up here today looking for it. He says, there's no country club here. This is it. This is it. This is the Armed Forces Radio.
That's funny.
Those are things that took away the sting of, the war and so forth, and being separated from family and friends and so forth. So at least there was some humor.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look back at it, those are things you still smile about.
Yep. Yep. You also told me a story earlier about the manner in which you received your medals or your ribbons. I was hoping you could tell that story again for the
yes.
record.
Well, when you were being discharged from the service at the separation center in Lido Beach, Long Island, during the war, World War II, people were sacrificing all sorts of metal for the war effort. I think in New Britain there was a huge congregational church that had enormous ornamental steel gate and steel fence on Main Street. And it was on a corner then of Main Street. The bank is there now. It was corner of Main and I think a Church or Street. And that was disassembled, and all that gate and everything else and the whole steel fence. That's where the bus used to stop and people would stand there. All beautiful ornamental fence. And that was scrap metal, and it was donated by the church. There were other churches that gave their bells. They sacrificed bells for the military effort. And of course people saved all tin cans. You saved and crushed all the tin cans, anything metal, sardine cans, anything metal. And I remember saving even cigarettes foil. Cigarettes in those days were wrapped in silver foil. So you would take the silver foil out and make a ball out of it, keep saving and saving it, and all that was meant for the war effort. People all saved for the war effort. In fact, I think people even saved grease, like grease from bacon grease and all the other grease. It is somehow used in making munitions. I'm not sure of it, but I do know grease was being saved. And my mother used to save it, my grandmother used to save it, and besides the tin cans and so forth. Somehow it is used, was being used in the making of munitions. And of course, all individuals made sacrifices, and girls even sacrificed their wedding gowns. They didn't have any silk wedding gowns in those days, and those were things that individuals. I do recall there was one article about an individual who was a parachutist, and one of the parachutes that he had, apparently in training, was either damaged or something, and they allowed him to take it. That he brought it was all nylon, and he brought it home so his girlfriend that he was marrying could use that to make her wedding gown. And it was a nylon parachute with nylon cord and all that. That shows you and my father was what they call a warden. He was a warden, aircraft warden, where Stanley Street is. As you go up Stanley Street, past there's a fire station and a school on the left. As you start going up that hill there, up on I can't recall what the name of the street is. Stanley Street, where go up that hill. Yeah. You get up to the top of the hill, past the Stanley Quarter Park, as on your right, the swimming pool. Mm-hmm. You get up to the top of that hill. On top of the hill, there was a watchtower, a huge watchtower, a wooden watchtower that they used to watch for fires, but there they used it for watching for aircraft. And people would take their turn. There was a telephone there, and I remember going with my father. And if he saw an aircraft, he would pick up the phone and he would dial a certain number and tell them, I see an aircraft lights, and so and so and so and so. The person is saying, well, that is, thank you for your acknowledgement, thank you for your observation. That is a flight we're aware of. They wanted to be aware of all flights because there was a great fear that there would be paratroopers that could come into our area and would drop. And this was immediately after Pearl Harbor and so forth. And I did meet, you hear of all sorts of stories of individuals in the service doing different things. One individual I did meet, different business contacts, he joined the Coast Guard. He lived in Iowa. And he was always fascinated with the ocean. And he wanted to be aboard a ship. And so when the war broke out and so forth, he went and joined the Coast Guard, and he was accepted. And he came and he was in training, boot camp training and so forth. He completed his training, and then you have an interview. What are your talents? What are your interests and so forth? And they began to ask him, well, where were you raised? Well, I was raised on a farm. And he said, well, what'd you do on the farm? Well, I helped my father build the cows and so forth. And then I helped with haying, and I helped with the horses. Oh, you helped with horses? Yes. He said, I used to ride the horses and make sure that they plowed the fields and so forth. And I would drive the horses. So you're familiar with horses? Yes, I am. Oh, very well. Gee whiz. You know, we've got a job just for you. They sent him, the Coast Guard sent him to Cape Cod, and he traveled all along the beaches, riding horses, looking for invaders coming off submarines, and looking for marks in the sand. And it was that type of security that caught individuals who were dropped off by a submarine on Long Island, who were saboteurs sent from Germany, who were being sent to destroy the Edison light plants. And it was a Coast Guard individual who spotted on the sand marks and so forth, and they caught these saboteurs. And eventually they were all executed. And President Roosevelt allowed that.
Well, you got to be secure in your home, right?
Yeah, you got to be secure. So everybody had some sort of duty.
Yeah. Well, I have no more questions here officially. Is there anything else that you would like to add that has not been covered in this interview?
I think we've covered things very well, Joshua. Really, everything has been covered well. The only thing I would like to mention is that if individuals have any hesitation about whether we did the right thing about using the atomic bomb during World War II, I think they must look at the atmosphere that existed in 1945. The Japanese military had their code was one of victory or death or suicide. They were not agreeing to any sort of surrender. They were in fact bringing troops from Manchuria and China to protect the homeland, which they knew where we were going to invade, because we had already invaded Okinawa and occupied it. If we didn't have the atomic bomb, we would have had to invade. In fact, we were preparing for invasion in November of that year, November 1945. And it would have been a tremendous loss of both Japanese lives and American lives if we had a land invasion of Japan. The fact that President Truman authorized use of the atomic bomb shortened the war, at least shortened it by 18 months. and saved millions of Japanese and Americans. So the use of the atomic bomb was the only alternative if you were going to shorten the war and you were going to defeat an enemy whose goal was victory or death. And we know that even though we used the atomic bomb twice, the military still was not willing to surrender. It was only the emperor who overrode the military, even though the ambassadors wanted to surrender. The military were overridden by the emperor, who made this radio tape, and the country, eventually Japan, accepted defeat and surrender. Otherwise, invasion of Japan would have taken place, and there would have been tremendous loss of life and another maybe 18 months of war. So with that in mind, I want people to understand that this was a last resort, and that it was not something that was not considered totally, and it was something that brought defeat to Japan, and that was the only way that it was possible to defeat them.
At that stage.
Yeah, at that stage.
I think you make a great point.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Well, I think you've covered it very well, and I hope that I've said some things of interest.
Oh, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. It's been a great story. I thank you very much for allowing me to interview you,
You're
and
very welcome. You're
going to make a great contribution to the Veterans History Project.
yeah, and willing to do it because there's so many others that were in active combat. Saw terrible things, who are unable to speak. They're unable to speak because the memories are too painful.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I could make a contribution and give this for the history individuals who want to study history.
That's right. Well, I mean, it's not just about them. It is as well about those veterans who can't or won't speak,
Yes.
Let them know that they're not alone,
Yeah.
that they are appreciated, that their contribution mattered. I think those are the founding principles of the Veterans History Project.
I know of two individuals that they cannot speak about their experiences because the pain is too great.
Yep.
One was a pilot shot down over Germany and was the only survivor with a couple others of his aircraft, and he just can't talk about it. He just too painful.
Lots of guys can't talk about it.
Yeah, he just can't talk about it. But I'm glad to make a contribution, and by God.